Okay.
that was, but it was a
Go ahead.
interesting sounding name.
It's good. It's good.
Stuck in my mind.
I doubt that very much, Jim. You are highly photogenic. Why do I hear that? I'm in the same boat. Ah, those days where I used to be the skinny mini, not so much anymore. Ooh, those sandwiches, love them.
Jesse.
Groaning,
Jesse,
gone.
I think yes, sir.
Okay.
Somebody's got to say the
So
word.
you have one on the other side of the country.
Did you want
and
food?
another one on the
No,
other side of the
continue.
world.
Just go ahead.
And one local.
Are you ready?
That's the same with us. We have our local daughter, she's the one with kids.
Everybody wants to find a place close to the podium. We're going to start shortly.
Different various spots.
Oh, blessed, Reverend for Westminster Presbyterian.
Wait, I think the mic's not on.
Is there a switch on it someplace? Just the knob?
Hello?
Yep, there you are.
Oh, blessed remnant of Westminster Presbyterian Church, if you will kindly grab everything you're going to nosh in the next few minutes and come to the table and be seated and be orderly and behave.
Just like you, Jim.
O God of peace, who said to us before he entered into his passion, my peace I leave you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives. We have had just within a very short period another bleak reminder of how vital preserving peace is. And we have that to mark our first program and peace potlucks. And we have a gentleman I met early on in my peace career here in Olympia, and I came from Cleveland. It was just a matter of time that I bumped into Glenn Anderson, who was possibly the central figure for Olympia. Everything else peaceful revolves around him. But since I don't know his particular history, I will not refer to the police reports. I'll just let him come on. Welcome, Glenn.
Thanks, Jim. There are no police reports about me. I've never been arrested, but other people do know other things, including some of my old pals in the room here. I like to give presentations to various religious congregations. And one time, a couple of decades ago, I was invited to speak to a different congregation as their sermon for that Sunday. And I got there early, of course, and in they'll have the little church program for that Sunday, and they had my name there listed as giving the sermon that day. I sat down in the front row so I'd be easy to get up and get into the pulpit. And an elderly woman whom I did not know, I'd known a lot of people in that congregation, I didn't know this woman who sat down there, and I saw she was opening the Sunday program for that service, and I pointed to the name there. I said, I've heard that guy speak before. He's not very good. So when they introduced me to give the sermon, and I got up, I did not look to see what expression was on her face, but I can see all your faces here now, so this is good. We'll have time at the end of this for questions and discussion. I really designed this presentation for you folks to loop around and keep touching on the topic you assigned to me, which is active nonviolence in daily life. And so you'll hear a lot about that from a couple different perspectives. I like the topic that you assigned to me. Some people think that nonviolence is nice and sweet, but oh, it's too weak for the real world. But actually, nonviolence is what works. Violence is what does not work, and we keep looping around into more cycles of violence, cycles of violence, cycles of violence. Nonviolence breaks that cycle. So nonviolence is the truly practical alternative that really does work in our daily lives and in public policy. And I'll share some of my own insights and experiences, and since this is a church, I can share some stuff about what Jesus and the early church were up to, which is more boldly nonviolent than what most people assume. I'll share some broader context to help you understand nonviolence more profoundly, including what Jesus taught and practiced, and including how all of us can do the theme for today's message about practicing active nonviolence in daily life. I've been active in working on peace activities in Olympia since 1975, and I do a lot of public events, and people often will ask me, how do you get involved in this? So without waiting for you to ask that, I'll just offer you, here are three main reasons why I developed my commitment to nonviolence. One is that my parents were terribly mismatched. They did not belong together, they did not get along with each other, and as a kid, growing up in the 1950s, I could see how conflict is handled badly. And I knew there got to be better ways of handling conflict than what I was experiencing as a kid growing up in the 1950s and 60s and beyond. Second point was I grew up in a mainstream, middle-of-the-road church that taught the usual middle-of-the-road theology. But even as a young person growing up, I recognized that what Jesus was promoting through the Gospels was a very radical message. Jesus and his early followers, the church, were promoting a new society that would be radically nonviolent, radically inclusive, and profoundly egalitarian. Mainstream theology usually just misses that larger, more profound message. But I knew that I wanted to be attentive to that. The third point of my background is when I was a kid, I could see how this radical, egalitarian, nonviolent message of Jesus would be a grounding for the kind of society that we need, because I could see as a kid, growing up, we had racial injustice pervasive and the civil rights movement coming along that was drawing upon Christian roots, the Vietnam War that violated the values that I held, and I could see a great gap between where we were as a society and where I knew we needed to be, and where my faith said we needed to be. So I felt I needed to do whatever I could to close that gap and create a society based on nonviolent values of peace and social justice. In the 1960s, my work for peace in Vietnam, I was active in the nonviolent part of the peace movement for Vietnam, but that also extended my awareness and my efforts into other issues. Nowadays, we know that all issues are interconnected. Foreign policy is also about global economics. Law enforcement is also about racial justice and injustice. The climate crisis is also about the power of big business. Immigration policy is all about how we use industrial methods of farming that are cruel to the people who do the actual farming as immigrant workers, and so forth. So when I became increasingly active in the peace movement in the late 1960s and into the 70s, I saw how many kinds of issues were all interconnected. And I needed to work to solve a very wide range of problems and get to the roots of this, which very often have to do with violence and systems of injustice and inequality. Some local governments avoid taking a stand on nuclear weapons because they say, oh no, that's a federal government issue, and we're only a local government. But if we have a nuclear war, local areas will be destroyed. If you look at photos of Hiroshima, it's just a wasteland of ash, right? And if we have a nuclear war, the feds won't save us from that, Olympia will be a wasteland of ash. And the politicians need to know that all of their voters will be dead. So some people think that the racial issues are a problem only for the South or only for big cities. But racial injustice occurs right here in Olympia in policing, housing, and so forth. For a decade, I've been working hard to solve the climate crisis. And the problem is not just a future problem that might arrive. We're already seeing, for a number of years now, radically disrupted weather, climate patterns, sea ice melting, glaciers melting, and it's also a local problem. A decade ago, I started helping the people who were creating what became the Thurston Climate Action Team, and they've been working to get our local governments to take specific, practical actions to solve the climate crisis here and now in our local communities. And while the biggest problems and most strategically crucial solutions are at the global level for a bunch of issues, individual people need to also make crucial decisions in our own daily lives. And this is part of what Westminster Presbyterian Church assigned to me, active nonviolence in daily life. So I want to share some more of my background about this. In 1972, my local draft board recognized that I am a conscientious objector. When I registered for the draft, for the military draft in 1966, I did not yet understand the context in which the military draft occurs. But in the next few years, I discovered both deeply and profoundly that my Christian faith and my conscience actually prohibited me from participating in war. So in 1972, I applied to my local draft board to be a conscientious objector, as federal law allows, the draft law from 1940. I wrote a 50-page application and explained clearly my beliefs and my sincerity. And the draft board did recognize that I am indeed a conscientious objector, as allowed by law. This is one way that I fulfill the topic that you assigned for me today. I practiced nonviolence in this aspect of my daily life. And when my draft lottery number came up, I found a civilian alternative service job to work at for the 2 years instead of being drafted into the Army. And I worked 2 years in the local welfare offices of the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services, DSHS. That job also was an opportunity to practice nonviolence in my daily life, because while a few DSHS employees vented society's contempt for poor people, I did my job as an ally of poor people inside the system. And I treated every person with equal human dignity, and I worked hard to make sure that every person got the benefits to which they were entitled. I also wrote about, after I get home from work, I write notes about stuff, and I wrote about the systemic problems of the welfare system and how the welfare system has been used by politicians and our culture to blame and humiliate poor people for being poor as a way of deflecting public attention away from the systems in our economy and our politics that cause poverty. So I shared my insights and my writings with elected officials, and they read them, including several state legislators. After leaving that job, I moved to Olympia in January of '75 so I could pay close attention to DSHS and to the state legislature, both of which were utterly clueless about the systemic problems that I was recognizing. And the statewide legislative lobbyist for a Seattle-based racial justice organization urged me to testify to some state legislative committees about my insights and some pending legislation. And I testified several times to legislative committees in 1975. And since then, I've testified to the legislative committees on a number of issues, a very wide range of issues, because I care about all the different issues. And all the issues are interconnected. So speaking up about crucial ethical matters of principle in these official public settings is yet another way of practicing nonviolence in daily life. All you have to do is go there and show up at the committee hearing and sign in and testify. What I want to share with you next includes some insights from Walter Wink. He was a great biblical scholar, and he wrote smart, insightful books about the radical message that Jesus was teaching, that the church mostly just ignored. The society in which Jesus lived 2,000 years ago discriminated against many kinds of people. The society discriminated against women, foreigners, poor people, people with disabilities, and so forth. And Jesus reached out to all of these kinds of outsiders and other vulnerable people, and he brought them in by affirming and validating their essential humanity with the message of inclusiveness and egalitarianism and nonviolence. His appeal went far, far beyond the typical Christian theology that focuses about, oh, we got to save your souls. And he was looking at how do we transform society so it actually will reflect the best ethics of the faith that we share. Jesus persistently taught people that God really wants a truly egalitarian society where every person is equal in God's sight, and all people need to be brought together in equality for a truly egalitarian society that affirms all kinds of people and promotes nonviolent action as the way to get there. And nowadays, some people make it seem like Christianity is all about opposing abortion and opposing homosexuality. Actually, Jesus had nothing about those. The Christians who claim that they're Jesus, who claim that these are Jesus' main points, are substituting their own biases in place of what Jesus actually taught. Actually, the only things that Jesus did condemn over and over again were rich people who failed to share with the poor, and people who were proud of their religiosity, but who violated the essential principles of their faith, the ethics. And he was relentless in denouncing those two kinds of hypocrites. Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5, 6, 7, includes a sequence of 3 teachings, one right after another in the Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus urges people to use nonviolent resistance against oppression. And the person who compiled Jesus' teachings into the Gospel according to Matthew combined these 3 teachings into the sequence of one verse after another in order to promote the message that Jesus was promoting nonviolent resistance against oppression. And I'll share these with you here now. These teachings, Matthew 5, 38 to 41, made enormous sense to the people who were hearing Jesus at his time and place. But modern people in our time and place do not know that historical context, and so people just miss the boat entirely. Now I'll explain each one of these 3 teachings about nonviolent resistance in Matthew 5, 38 to 41, and these will be familiar verses to you. And you'll see why the authorities of his time saw Jesus as a nonviolent revolutionary who needed to be killed because he was nonviolently upsetting the status quo. So the first one is turn the other cheek. When Jesus told people turn the other cheek, he was not telling people just to get beaten up. And rather, he was showing oppressed people how they can nonviolently resist their oppressors. Can I volunteer to come up? And I want to just show the thing. I won't slap your cheek. But can I get a volunteer to come up? And thank you. So, thank you.
He said he wouldn't hit me.
I won't hit you, yeah. In the society where Jesus lived, people used their right hands for all their daily activities. Everything you did was the right hand. And the left hand was considered ritually unclean. It was used only for toilet functions, okay? So notice that in Matthew 5:39, Jesus specifies that you're struck on the right cheek. So her right cheek is there, right? And I have to use my right hand because that's what you do in the culture. The way your arms and shoulder work, you don't do this. It's a backhand to her right cheek. Because she's only a woman, she doesn't count, right? Or she's a slave, or she's a child. Somebody of low status. So that's a backhand is a dismissive, contemptuous gesture. If this were a man of equal social status to me, I'm a man wearing a necktie, and then I would use, and we were fighting, we'd fight with the face of our hand, right? The front of our hands. That's an equal status. So when Jesus tells her to turn the other cheek, if you turn your left cheek to me, I can't do my backhand to her because my arm and shoulder don't work that way. I'd have to slap her with my right hand, which is what I would do to another man of equal status to me wearing a necktie, right? Thanks. Okay, so what Jesus was doing was telling people to do made perfect sense to the people because he was speaking to women, poor people, other people of low status who are used to being backhanded by an oppressor in the society that had systemic injustice, right? And so when he tells people turn the other cheek, it's a nonviolent strategy to help people understand, oh, here's a way that I can force my oppressor to recognize me as an equal by having to use the face of his hand to strike me. That's pretty cool, and people at his time would have gotten it. Nobody nowadays in our time and place knows that. Now, second verse, right after that, urging the clever nonviolent strategy to resist social oppression, Jesus offers in Matthew 5:40 an example of how to nonviolently resist economic oppression. He says, if anyone would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak also. In his time, people wore kind of a lightweight, floppy garment, kind of looked like a nightgown sort of thing, lightweight fabric, and then over that they'd have a coat, right? And so he says, if somebody would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak also. The lighter weight garment was the cloak. And the poor people that he was talking to knew exactly what he meant, but people in our time and place don't. So here's what Walter Wayne, the biblical scholar, says. Poor people were in debt and they had to get loans from the local lender, and they'd have to give their outer garment, their coat, as collateral. So the lender would have that until you paid back the loan. But their law had enough compassion built into it that you could get your coat back so you don't get too cold overnight. But then in the morning you have to bring your coat back to the lender, right? And some people were so hopelessly in debt that they would never be able to pay back their loans. So the lenders would take them to court and permanently get ownership of their collateral, their outer coat, leaving them cold overnight. So Jesus spoke to people who were so poor that they knew what that experience was about, that these people would never be able to repay their loans, so the lender would sue them. As Jesus said, if somebody would sue you and take your coat, he said, let them have your cloak also. Now, in that society, there was a lot of, if you have a question, I'll catch it at the end.
No, I didn't have a question.
Oh, okay. The culture at that time had shame upon nakedness, right? But worse shame than the person who was naked was if somebody else had caused your nakedness. The greater shame goes to them. So when Jesus said that just go ahead and give me your other garment, and you stream out of the courtroom naked, and your friends see you on the sidewalk, hey Glenn, how come you're naked? First National Bank took all my clothes. Okay, so that lays bare the economic injustice in their society at that time. So that was Jesus' clever, nonviolent way of having people who are really poor put the shame on the unjust economic system. Third example, right after that, he gives a third example about going the second mile. And nowadays, people don't know what going the second mile means. They think, oh, that's a business that does extra good customer service. I brought my car to have the brakes repaired and they washed it. That was going the second mile. That's not what Jesus is saying. His third strategy in this going the second mile thing was helping people devise nonviolent resistance to oppression, in this case the oppression of being occupied by the Roman Empire's army. And in Jesus' time, Jesus argued going the second mile as a clever way of nonviolently resisting that imperialistic oppression. The Roman army was occupying that region for many, many years. The Roman army would oppress people, but Rome was savvy enough to realize we want the Roman Empire to last a long time, so we can't oppress the people so heavily that they'll rise up in rebellion against us. So they had a law that says a Roman soldier can force a local person to carry your pack for a mile, but only 1 mile. After that, they have to give the pack back to the soldier, and the soldier will find another local to oppress to carry it another mile, right? And Jesus said that if somebody, in Matthew 5:41, he tells people if the soldier forces you to carry his pack for 1 mile, carry it a second mile also. And that's a clever, nonviolent action that exposes the Roman military's inherent oppression and gets the soldier in trouble and exposes the inherent cruelty of the whole Roman Empire occupying their lands. So it's another clever nonviolent resistance method. So clearly, when the Gospel of Matthew sequences these 3 steps for nonviolent resistance, one right after another, to different kinds of oppression: social oppression, economic oppression, imperial occupation by the Roman army, it tells people how to nonviolently resist oppression in their daily lives. And no wonder the authorities wanted to kill it. So here's something, even if we don't have that society now, we can still practice active nonviolence in our daily lives in whatever ways make sense to us here in Olympia, Washington in 2023. So Jesus' Sermon on the Mount supports the principle, the topic that you assigned to me today. And these are examples that we can adapt for our time and place to do this. So we have to look for opportunities in our time and place to practice active nonviolent resistance against oppression in our daily lives, and look for ways to advance the whole notion of nonviolence and the practicality and the power of nonviolence. And we'll be talking about that in just a moment. I want to just say a bit more about what I understand about Jesus. He wanted people to deepen their faith in God, and he wanted people to practice love and compassion for all people, right? He wanted people to understand that God wants a radically egalitarian and nonviolent society. Jesus gathered people together to create that new society. They heard his teachings, and he organized people who became the church to be the start of that new society that would practice and live this and transform society according to these nonviolent and egalitarian values. He lived in a society that discriminated against some kinds of people, as I said: women, poor people, people with disabilities, people of different ethnic or religious groups, whatever. And Jesus persistently broke down the barriers of discrimination. He repeatedly welcomed all kinds of people into a new, loving community that was radically nonviolent and radically egalitarian. And that bold, loving community was the early church. And Jesus and his disciples created the church to become that new society and spread these principles and practices of nonviolence and compassion throughout all society and beyond their local area. So this is not just a space-limited thing, as it was during his time, but it spread, right? And at the time of the Pentecost, in the book of Acts, it says that the Holy Spirit enabled people to speak other languages, and people who had gathered from other places were amazed that these early church people were speaking their languages. So that spread this message again. Again, Jesus said nothing about abortion. He said nothing about homosexuality. He very often did lambaste the rich people who failed to share with the poor, and he lambasted people who were outwardly religious but who failed to practice social justice. The political and religious establishment saw Jesus' new society as a threat to their power, and so they killed him. But his early church followers created this new thing, and in the early church, women had powerful roles of leadership along with men. It was non-sexist. It was unprecedented for that time. And for a few centuries, the church was totally pacifist. There's no evidence of any Christian joining the military for the first couple centuries. But in the 300s, Christianity changed from being illegal to being the Roman Empire's official religion. And so then they started supporting war, and they never looked back upon the actual message of Jesus. So I affirm the authentic religion that Jesus taught and practiced, and therefore I oppose militarism. I support social justice and equality for all kinds of people, and I encourage everybody to practice the topic that you assigned me today, active nonviolence in daily life. I want to share a story that when I spoke to a church about 40 years ago. I moved to Olympia in 75, and I've been organizing here at the grassroots level ever since. And I have been invited to conduct a great many speaking engagements to various local faith communities. In the early 1980s, President Reagan was aggressively promoting a very militaristic foreign policy and escalating a nuclear arms race. And people around the world were afraid that Reagan would start a nuclear war because of his manic opposition to the Soviet Union. and communism. So I was organizing locally against nuclear weapons and for a peaceful foreign policy. Spoke to a lot of audiences, including some churches. A mainstream Protestant congregation in Olympia invited me to talk to them about Jesus' message about nonviolence and peace. And I was the featured speaker for the adult Sunday school hour they had between the first service and second service, and they had the adult Sunday school hour in between. They invited me to be the speaker for that one Sunday. And we had a very good turnout, maybe this number of people. The turnout included the congregation's pastor and the president of their church council. And I told them a much shortened version of what I'm sharing with you today. And then we opened up for questions and answers, as we will do when I finish this thing. I will finish it. But we opened it up for questions. And the first comment came from the president of the church council. And he said to everybody, including the pastor of his church, who was present, that he agreed that Jesus was urging peace and nonviolence, but he added, we need to set aside what Jesus taught because the Russians are a danger to America. Unlike him, I want churches to be authentic and faithful to what Jesus taught in practice. And I believe that in our daily lives, we can do that, and indeed we must do that if we are actually faithful. So that means living active nonviolence, and if we set aside those principles of active nonviolence and social justice, then we're hypocrites, and that's the kind of people that Jesus kept denouncing. I want to help us understand nonviolence in a bit more depth right here for a few minutes. We can understand nonviolence profoundly and promote practical ways of using nonviolence throughout society as well as in our daily lives, the topic you gave me. Here are some insights from a variety of sources, and I'll share some insights that I share in a free workshop I often conduct to help people understand the depth and power and practicality of nonviolence. A few minutes ago, I mentioned Walter Wink's insights into the Sermon on the Mount, those 3 teachings. Here's something else that Walter Wink wrote in support of nonviolence. He wrote, it is surprising how few people have seriously considered nonviolence as a way of life and a strategy for social change. We trust violence. Violence saves. We trust violence because we're afraid, and we will not relinquish our fears until we're able to imagine a better alternative. So Jesus does invite us to imagine better alternatives and to practice it. Another wise person wrote this, societies that rely heavily on the use of force are likely to be less efficient, more costly, and more unpleasant than those where trust is maintained by other means. So I want to share a bit about nonviolence, what it really is, why it works, and why it's more practical than violence. Our nation is immersed in violence. Our foreign policy is extremely violent. Violence also is part of our domestic systems. Poverty is inherently violent. So are sexism and racism. Our criminal justice system relies upon violence. And the list goes on and on. We need to replace those violent systems with nonviolent ways of running our society. And nonviolence needs to be our method as well as our goal. People are taught that there are only 2 responses to a problem, fight or flight. You either use violence and fight back, or you run away. But actually, there's a third alternative that commonly works better, and that's nonviolence. Nonviolence is a different way to deal with the problem. It's a way to fight back, but without using violence. And it's a way to turn things around. Nonviolence is more than a set of specific tactics. It's grounded in human nature, history, psychology, spirituality, and more. And the universe functions in ways that allow nonviolence to work better than violence. Martin Luther King and other people have said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And all of us that went to 10th grade and took geometry remember a line is a perfectly straight geometric line. If it has a bit of curvature to it, that makes it an arc. And it doesn't need to have much curvature to be an arc. Even a little bit is enough. And King and others have said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The universe wants to work for justice and nonviolence. Violence is immoral. Violence often does not work well. It often backfires. We have to stop the cycle of violence and replace it with a cycle of nonviolence. And nonviolence really does work better than violence. Some people think that that nonviolence is nice and moral, but it's too naive and impractical for the real world. Actually, violence does not work. It just keeps making problems worse. Nonviolence is what really does work. 100 years ago, the people who were promoting World War I promised that this would be the war to end all wars. So I don't know if you've noticed, but we've not had a century of peace since 1918, right? Wars just keep provoking more. Nonviolence is more than nice and moral, it's practical and it's powerful. We have to use nonviolence in our daily lives, and let's convert all of our public policies to practice nonviolence in very practical ways. And research has shown that nonviolence really does work better than efforts that include violence. And I've got some resource here. If anybody wants a handout, I can offer that to anybody at the end about resources for organizing nonviolent movements, including resources showing how effective and powerful nonviolence is. Violence keeps us stuck. Nonviolence offers a creative alternative. It's been said that war is a failure of imagination, and the establishment keeps teaching wars. If you go to history class in high school or even in college, it's all about top-down stuff like wars and generals and battles and blah, blah, blah. They never tell you much about the women's movement, the environmental movement, the labor movement, anything that's bottom-up, that's an alternative to the top-down violent model. If we recognize the main dimensions of violence, then we can devise nonviolent responses and alternatives to all of these. So unjust social and economic systems are violent against people. Pollution is violent against the environment, God's beautiful creation, and so forth. And we Americans, more than people anywhere else on earth, are so used to thinking that we can solve international problems by sending troops or bombing countries or using regime change, which means overthrowing a government to a government that will be obedient to the United States government. But that is not how civilized nations behave. If your only tool is a hammer, you're going to treat every problem as if it's a nail. And since the late 1800s, and especially since the 1940s, the U.S. has been threatening and using military violence against many other nations. We have, the U.S. has military bases in most countries around the world. We've overthrown dozens of governments worldwide in the past 70 years, including a lot of democracies. And also our federal government wastes enormous amount of money on the military, and that means that Congress and presidents of both parties say, let's keep having lots more military, lots more nuclear weapons, instead of ending poverty, ending homelessness, providing health care, providing education, providing the environmental cleanup. All that stuff is cast aside because they are hell-bent to have more nuclear weapons and more military. The U.S. spends as much on nuclear weapons as all the nations in the world combined. So, nonviolence, as I said earlier, is consistent with how the universe works best. Martin Luther King said, as I mentioned, the arc of the moral universe is long but it bends toward justice, and I agree. The universe and humanity function better when we practice justice instead of injustice, when we live peacefully instead of violently, when we speak the truth instead of deceiving others, and when we respect the environment instead of abusing it. So nonviolent behavior is congruent with how the universe functions best, and nonviolent behavior is sustainable. But violence, military violence, and human rights abuses and disregard for the environment, those are not sustainable. So let's ground ourselves in nonviolent values and practice nonviolence both in our daily lives and in public policy. I'm almost done. We're getting close to the end here. If we recognize that all people are one human family, don't let anybody split us apart into us versus them. Oh, they're the wrong religion. Oh, they're the wrong sexual orientation. Oh, they're the wrong color, whatever. We're all in this together, and together we can make solutions. Nonviolence rewrites the script of what conflict is about. We'll always have conflict with us. The decision that we have is, are we going to respond to conflicts that exist by using violence against somebody, or are we going to be creative and working to change the script, rewrite the script, and have nonviolence change how we play this out, and use methods that are consistent with the ends that we seek. And if we want a world that's peaceful and just, we have to use methods that are peaceful and just. If we plant violent and unjust seeds, like we've been doing for a long time, we end up with a violent and unjust society. But if we plant seeds that are peaceful and fair, we'll have a society of peace and fairness. And this is in our daily lives, like the topic that you assigned to me today, but also as we express our lives through public policy, in how we organize our society, how we organize our environment, how we develop foreign policy, and so forth. We have to work actively to promote these. And let's see, there's some more I can say about the evidence that proves that, but I don't want to get into the details yet. The solutions include helping people of every faith recognize and appreciate the compassion that are nonviolent, the compassion and nonviolence that are inherent in every faith. And all the major world religions have compassion strongly rooted in them, and love and fairness. And we need to help people recognize and appreciate that in other faiths as well as their own. And let's teach profound nonviolence as both ethical and practical. Let's teach it in families, in K through 12 schools, teach it in colleges, teach it throughout communities. Include the individual level, the interpersonal level, and the social, economic, and systemic levels at the big scale. Support local conflict resolution programs, like here we have the Dispute Resolution Center of Thurston County, mediatethurston.org. We can explore how to overhaul every system and rebuild it based on nonviolence. What would a nonviolent economy look like? What would a nonviolent criminal justice system look like? What would a nonviolent foreign policy look like? And how would these function? The list goes on and on. And so I invite people to connect with organizations. And again, I have some resources on the list here. And we have a lot of exciting and positive opportunities to practice nonviolence in our daily lives as individuals and our society. And turn it loose for questions, comments, discussion. Jim?
I meant to mention, I'd invite people to stay and help clean up. That's a nonviolent invitation.
And I'm skilled at operating a broom. I've operated a broom before, both as paid employment and as volunteer. So, good. Some of us can help Jim stay and clean up. Joanne?
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the course that we conducted, because you were talking about education, but just some examples of that.
I mentioned this to you, or somebody I mentioned to, that Joanne and Jim and another guy and I put on a 4-part course about helping people understand nuclear weapons. And we've done this in person a number of years ago. When the pandemic hit, we started using Zoom. So we've conducted the course many times for people all over the place. And it's about the history of nuclear weapons, how we got into this mess, what the policies have been over the years, what they currently are, and a bunch more stuff. But we look at problems and we look at solutions. And it's fresh information that almost nobody in our society knows about, because both of the two big political parties have a bipartisan consensus that we got to have lots and lots and lots of nuclear weapons and keep making them bigger and nastier and more dangerous, and having policies that make it easier to use them. Some people are frustrated. We've not even had a nuclear war since 1945. We dropped 2 bombs on Japan, but we've not been able to have a nuclear war since then. Why can't we have that? So they've been changing policies to make it easier to start a war, and they've been designing, since the late 1960s, weapons that are designed to be used in a first strike against other nations. We can talk about that further, but we cover all that stuff in the course, and it's been very well received. We've had people from all over, and some people take the course more than once. So, other questions from anybody that I don't yet know, besides my pals here in the front row?
Could you share a real life example of some of your own nonviolent protests where you have seen positive outcomes in person? Well,
I mentioned a couple things that I've done from the past, like the conscientious objector status, this individual position, but if we're going to change our culture to be nonviolent, we got to talk to people. We got to talk to people at Westminster Presbyterian Church, and I've talked to people in other kinds of audiences, and we've got to organize movements. Not everything is a nonviolent protest. In fact, the word protest gets maligned because they think it's like negative towards something. Pro is the prefix that means for, and test is like a testimonial, where you testify, you're speaking. So a protest really is speaking up for something positive, not just protesting against something, right? But we've done organizing. In 1982, I was active in the Nuclear Weapons Freeze campaign here in Thurston County, and this is, I mentioned Reagan's mania for escalating nuclear weapons in the early 80s, and people elsewhere in the country, back in Massachusetts, were saying at the local level, geez, why don't we have something local here to stop that madness? And a couple people came up with the idea of, let's have a nuclear weapons freeze. What was happening at the time was people in the peace movement were saying, look at all these numbers of nuclear weapons, look at how damaging they would be if they ever were used, blah, blah, blah. And the people who like nuclear weapons would argue about the numbers. Well, yeah, but look at the numbers that Russia has. Or look at the megatonnage of each side, or the what they call the throw weight that each missile would carry. And the people were bogging down in the numbers instead of getting into the reality. So the freeze campaign came along in Western Massachusetts. And people said, hey, instead of arguing about numbers, let's just freeze everything now. Just stop all the weapons testing, deployment, manufacture, research, just stop everything. And the public could say, okay, we can understand that, let's just stop that. And we did that here, and in December of '81, I met with a couple dozen people in someone's home on the west side of Olympia, and we decided, yeah, we can do a freeze campaign here in Thurston County. So we started organizing in December of '81 for a ballot issue countywide in November of '82, and we won in less than a year with 62.5% of the vote, saying just freeze everything. And this was countywide, including the conservative parts of the county. And by the time we got to that election day, we had 300 volunteers in the Thurston County Nuclear Weapons Freeze campaign. And some of us are still around and agitating, including Bob, whom you know, Bob Ziegler was one of us. Anyway, there are things that people can organize, whether it's at a local ballot issue or speaking, or 3 times a week I'm holding signs for peace in different places around town. One of the things we've been, and we get positive responses from pedestrians and passengers. Homeless people don't want to get blown up in a nuclear war any more than the rest of us do. I was holding a sign a few years ago at the corner of Sylvester Park opposing nuclear weapons. A homeless guy came by and said, you know, our country spends billions of dollars every year on nuclear weapons, and I'm still homeless. I said, yeah, you're right. You're smarter than the people in Congress, because they keep funding weapons and not funding an end to poverty. So this guy was right on board, smarter than the Congress people. And we hold a big banner over I-5 once a week, Thursdays from 11 a.m. to 12 noon on East Side Street overpass. And the banner says nuclear weapons are illegal, because under the Geneva Conventions, they're illegal, and they have been for a long time, but also under the new Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which 69 nations, not the US, have ratified. They would outlaw anything to do with nuclear weapons. So we do that, and we have other handheld signs. That's a big banner that people on the freeway can see. But we do that, and we get more than 50% of the people driving on the East Side Street overpass honk or wave support for it. Most people in Olympia want to abolish nuclear weapons once we offer that to them. But most people don't pay attention because it's a big, hard, scary issue. It's not pleasant to think about. And the news media don't report on it. The big politicians don't want to deal with it because they're getting funded by weapons manufacturers. But so it's up to ordinary people. But we are shifting public opinion. We got ourselves invited here to Westminster Presbyterian Church to talk about nonviolence and peace and all the good stuff. So thanks to the congregation here. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we've done a lot of things and made good results going back to when I was in college, and we did some good stuff and ever since the 60s. Other questions? Comments? Argument? You again.
Join us on November 5th, because you'll hear more positive results.
What happens on November 5?
We speak.
You speak here in this room.
3-part series.
Wow. Yeah, I know the 3-part series. I just want to get an explicit promotion for a November 5th gig. Yeah.
Please come back, yeah. It's going to be a positive presentation.
Yeah. Go ahead.
On the, October 29th, I'm gonna be sharing about congregational peace work.
Okay, great. And this guy has a long background. He and I met a good number of years ago, and happy to reconnect with you again today.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you've done any work with counter recruitment.
Oh yeah, I have. That's a hard thing to do. What happens is, if you have an economy where people who don't have much in the way of skills can't get a decent paying job, right? You might get something at minimum wage. The federal government has arranged it so that instead of raising the federal minimum wage, which has been stuck at $7.25 for many, many, many years, they say, why don't you join the Army? Why don't you join the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force? And so the military puts itself out there as an employer for people who otherwise don't have skills because we don't adequately fund education, we don't adequately raise the minimum wage, and so forth. And so they're trying to suck people into the military. The danger, several dangers. One is they cause people to be inculcated into this military culture that promotes violence as a way to solve problems. And here in our society, we have gun violence. And people who use gun violence at the local level, even the family level, have been taught by our culture and our militarism that guns are the way to solve problems. If your wife won't do what you tell her to do, you can shoot your wife. If a foreign country won't do what the United States tells them to do, we can bomb them. We can overthrow their government. And it's that militarism, and it inculcates the population, and we need to have alternatives, other kinds of employment, other kinds of better minimum wage. A number of years ago, there was a news account of a guy up here at Fort Lewis. He was in the Army, he was in Afghanistan, and I don't know if you remember waterboarding. They were trying to get people to confess to crimes, and so they'd have a tank of water, they'd strap a person to the board, and tilt the person down so your head was underwater. And just before the person drowned, they'd bring him back up and say, now will you report to us the names of people who are terrorists that you know? And if the guy wouldn't do it, they'd put him under again, over again. And so there's a guy at Fort Lewis who had learned how to do that in the Army in Afghanistan. He came home and he had a 4-year-old daughter who was not learning her ABCs right. And he waterboarded her in the kitchen sink. So we have lots and lots and lots of examples of people who have been mentally, psychologically screwed up the military, and they come home from Vietnam. That was my generation, right? And they can't keep their families together because they've been screwed up mentally, psychologically. And people have become addicted to drugs and alcohol and other stuff. And a lot of people couldn't keep their jobs, couldn't get jobs that they could stay in, families broke up. The support the troops mania is baloney. The people who supported the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq couldn't tell people, support the wars, because the public knew those wars were baloney and cruel. Instead they said, support the troops. They just shifted the thing. But if you want to support the troops, keep them home where it's safe. Don't send them off to be killed or to be injured. I have friends who have been helping veterans. Some friends who are veterans have been helping other veterans get VA benefits for extremely serious psychological problems and what they call moral injury. You've been so traumatized in your conscience that your body is reacting negatively toward you, and you need treatment. So anyway, when the recruiters go to the schools, they don't tell you all that stuff. They don't tell these young guys, if you go to war and come back, you won't be able to keep a girlfriend. You won't be able to get married and have a successful family life because you'll be traumatized by what you've done and experienced there. And there is a movement afoot to do counter recruitment to try and get into the schools, but the schools don't want us there because they say, oh, you've got a political agenda, but the military's come here and they're offering jobs. But one of my recent TV programs I did, I think maybe early this year or sometime last year, I had some people who've been actively working on military counter recruitment, and they have ways of getting into the schools and reaching out to people. But that's something that needs doing. Again, these are system level things. And so we can extrapolate from our own personal commitments to nonviolence and say, let's have a nonviolent economy so that people can have jobs that are nonviolent instead of the military being the hiring source of last resort. Because we underfund education and Congress keeps the federal minimum wage at 7.25. Other folks? Anybody who's not already my pal that wants to speak up, thank you. But anybody else?
Do you have some other stories of where creative nonviolence has been successful?
There are lots of them. I've got a lot of stuff on the nonviolence part of my blog, and there's some resources here. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union had these satellite nations, right? Lithuania, and Estonia, and Latvia. They were oppressing them and trying to Russify them. They were trying to crush, this is toward the end of the Cold War, they were trying to crush out the local Estonian language and make everybody speak Russian only, right? And in, I think it might have been Estonia, it might have been Latvia, Lithuania, one of those. People had what they called the singing revolution, and Lithuania wasn't, and people would gather locally and they would sing their traditional folk songs in their own national language as a nonviolent act of defiance against the Soviet Union's efforts to Russify everybody and stamp out the local languages and have Russian only. So, and that it actually worked, and those three nations got their independence by this kind of nonviolent resistance. There are examples that the history books never teach about effective nonviolent resistance against Nazis during World War II, against the Soviet Union. In the southern part of France, there's a rural community called Les Chambon, where it was an area where Jews were escaping from Paris, which the Nazis were occupying and really treating horribly, and as you know, killing Jews. And the Jews found out that if they could get to Les Chambon in the southern part of France, this rural town, they would be put up as refugees. And this little town has just a few thousand people, and they provided sanctuary for more thousands of people than what they had living in the community. And so when the Nazi SS folks came up, who's this? Oh, this is my cousin visiting from Paris. Okay. And they had all kinds of people, this whole underground thing, and then they'd find ways to get them onto ships that could go to Sweden or someplace neutral to escape. But they had, there's a guy there who knew how to do counterfeit printing, and they had him forging documents to show that you're this person. And now you have documentation to prove it, so if you ever get caught, no, I belong here, I'm from here. Oh, okay. There's all kinds of, and then there's a book that I've read about that called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed, and I've read the book. We had a film about it called Weapons of the Spirit, and we got that showed at the Olympia Film Society. This is decades ago. But the stuff is out there, but it's not taught in the schools. You're not allowed to teach about nonviolence because it's upsetting to the status quo. But there are just lots and lots of these things. We brought down people in the Philippines, nonviolently brought down Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator, who was heavily, heavily armed by the United States, heavily, heavily supported by the US government in a bunch of ways, and people in the Philippines brought down nonviolently through what they call the People Power Uprising. And the Shah of Iran, whom the United States had imposed upon them to be their dictator in the early 1950s, was overthrown by people nonviolently protesting in the streets of Tehran and elsewhere in the country of Iran. And they expelled the Shah nonviolently. And he was heavily armed with the US's best and most sophisticated weapons. And in fact, the Senate Armed Services Committee, the US Senate Armed Services Committee, is not a left-wing pacifist organization, right? They held a hearing on the US weapons sales program to Iran, and they described the weapons sales to Iran as out of control. This is the US Senate Armed Services Committee when they investigated it. It was just out of control. And the people overthrew that, the Shah. non-violently. So there's lots of examples out there, and again, some of the, one of the resources I promote here is stuff by Gene Sharp, who researched for many years about the power of nonviolence. He had resisted the military draft during the Korean War, and when he got out of federal prison, he realized that, okay, he had himself avoided going to war, but what about at the macro level, the system level? And he started studying the power of nonviolent resistance throughout societies. And he wrote extensively, and I've read a bunch of his books. I went to Seattle, heard him speak in 1978. And he's written extensively. His stuff's been translated into lots of languages. I have the website here on the sheet of paper. And people have used his stuff to overthrow dictatorships in lots and lots of places around the world. History courses don't teach you that. Yeah, Joanne?
Some teachers do.
Huh?
Some teachers do.
Yeah, well, Joanne was a great social studies teacher,
Yeah, I know a lot of great social studies teachers.
and there were some others, yeah.
At least they're trying.
Yeah.
They don't get fired in Texas.
Yeah.
But anyway, do you think that Ukraine is reviving the peace movement right now? Do you see any surgeons of the peace resistance?
It's a real mixed bag, because we who live in this country hear only the official war-making thing. Oh, we've got to support Ukraine militarily. That's the, fighting a war is the only way to win, right? And Glenn Anderson's pitch to you today says, nope, there are other ways. And there actually have been diplomatic efforts. The U.S. government has rebuffed all of the diplomatic efforts throughout this thing.
What about grassroots?
And in Ukraine, there are grassroots people working for peace. There are draft resistors. There are people working for peace. They're not reported on in the U.S. news media. And the U.S. government does not want to hear about them and does not want to support them, because we have this mania that says the only way to solve problems is with lots of bombing and shooting. That's how you solve problems. It's that tunnel vision. But there is a nonviolent movement there, and it comes and goes. But like any nonviolent movement, any peace movement, any place in the world, they need support from the outside. So in Israel and Palestine, there are people on both sides working for peace and nonviolence. They don't get covered in the press, right? The press and the politicians only focus on the violent stuff, and all the nonviolent stuff gets ignored and suppressed. But this is true in other places too that have suffered under oppression. And that's what Jesus lived under too in his time. He was trying to help people say, here are some ways to get out from under the oppression by exposing it and nonviolently resisting it, refusing to be oppressed. Yeah?
On behalf of Westminster Presbyterian Church, I'd like to thank you for coming and presenting this program of nonviolence. But I'm still going to ask people to clean up.
Great.
Lest someone of a less nonviolent character come and grab me by the ear and
Yeah.
say,
Well, thanks. One of my criteria for successful speaking engagement is if everybody stayed awake, and so I'm happy to report that it's a success on that score. So thank you all.